rain today in this miserable weather, and the flooding and everything else. Anyway, it's fantastic. We've got Richard Gentle coming to speak again. He's a well-known speaker here. He's been many times. Today he's going to talk about money and abundance and changing your ideas about money. And in view of that, he's offered to pay for everybo's place today. So you don't have to pay anything.
You can spend it on coffee and books.
Yes, it's all included. So, yeah, great. Thank you, Richard. Over to you.
Right. Okay, well, why do I want to talk about money? Well, it's a major component of our society, isn't it? All of our lives are affected by it, and it enables us to live and make many choices. But lack of it can have major impacts on our health and well-being, stress, anxiety, self-esteem, and general we can be quite overwhelmed by not having access to enough of it. I wrote this book recently called Nevermind a Million, and you might say, well, why title a book Nevermind a Million? Well, throughout my spiritual kind of journey, people have often written things about, well, you know, I was really down and out. It's usually Americans that have written these things. I was really down and out, and I didn't have any money. I was in the gutter in on Skid Row, and then suddenly, the next day, I had $1 million, or I started a little company, and I turned over $10 million in the first month. Well, those sound great and they inspire you, but how many of us does that happen to, really? So, rather than thinking about making $1 million or having £1 million, perhaps we could actually start and improve our situation from where we are in an easier and more manageable way. Likewise, desperate people wish they could win a fortune, and many people think money will solve everything. And in fact, when you hear of some of our American friends, and most of my books are sold to Americans, and most of the talks I give are to American audiences, you would think that money was the only thing they ever thought about in life. And it's a bit like the British always talking about the weather, which of course we've done today. But of course, probably since about the 80s, when Thatcher started coming in with her things, and everything seemed to be out for number one, then the money thing did start getting talked about much more, and I think we've started to talk more about it now than weather, which is saying something for Richard, isn't it? So if your experience of money is low and skimping, you are not sending out the right electromagnetic vibration from your being in order to attract abundance and wealth. And a large amount of money would be out of your comfort level. Now, I realise that I'm dealing with a mixed audience here, and also the fact that when people get more to our ages, we've usually sorted it all out. So the possibility is that none of you are particularly suffering from lack of income or pensions or whatever else. But there's a younger generation who turn to all sorts of things to get money, or they get depressed and they find that the only way to relieve that stress is maybe to start moving into drugs or things that just make them feel better. And I think that so this is really aimed at those people as well. But of course, if you do enjoy an abundance already, your approach to your life and the way you feel and the way you think and what you say to people subsequently will maintain your income coming in nicely. Or otherwise, if you perhaps start worrying. So if you start worrying about government policies, how they might affect your pensions and things like that, you're kind of focusing your attention in the wrong place. I'm reminded of a saying: if you give a poor person a lot of money, you do not now have a rich person, you have a poor person with money. And this is indicative really of the way people actually think. Conversely, if you take the money away from someone who's wealthy and you distribute it amongst other people, it won't be long before each person returns to their former situation, because a rich person's still got the mentality of a rich person. And unless you actually change the way you feel about your situation, that's what you're attracting from the conscious field of the universe that we're in. I'm going to just give you a quick rundown. I've actually split this. I started with about 7 pages of this. It's now down to about this much. Of my own money history. Now, this is not an attempt to look for any sympathy, because as somebody who knows that he creates his own reality, I look at it more that obviously I was going through a learning experience. But I was born into a childhood of quite a good environment, really. We actually lived in land. You'd probably think that we were well off. But in those days, these sorts of places were cheaper and people could afford to buy them. So I had plenty of room to run around outside and make things. And my parents were quite creative. My father was very into art, and he taught art and later became an art advisor in Manchester. But one of the things that they didn't do in my family, and probably your families even, I mean, it was talk about money. I mean, really, you know, say where it came from. You know, why is your dad out all day? Or why is your mum out all day? And, you know, how do we get the house that we're living in? So really, there was no education even at home about money. In fact, it was more of a taboo subject. There seemed to be... My father came from a kind of Victorian background, really, and so these were things that you didn't really talk about. It was a private matter, and he extended that to his own family. It would be easier to have a discussion about sex than it would about money, you know. I mean, that's how bad it was. And then I went to school, and there was a certain amount of the usual teasing and bullying that you get as children. But I think my self-esteem was knocked a little bit, although I did do quite a bit when I was in junior school. I set up a museum in an old chicken shed and raised some money for school funds. So I was in quite a high vibrational rate, really, even with everything else. And I used to make vehicles that looked like proper cars to ride around in. And then we moved to Yorkshire, and that was a baptism of fire, because I'd only just turned 11. I had 6 weeks in Hoyland Swain primary school before a long summer holiday, and then it was straight into the secondary school that had just upped its numbers to 13,000 pupils, 1,300 pupils. It must be higher than that. It must be like 13,000 from 9,000. So it was quite a jump, and so I didn't have much time to get to learn the Yorkshire language. And when I say learn the Yorkshire language, I don't mean speak it, I mean learn it and understand what people said, which is something I was able to do. And then I went to the sixth form, and then I went to art school in Barnsley, and then my parents got a divorce. Now, I wasn't too bothered at the time, because I saw it on the cards. It wasn't because they really had big arguments or fallouts, but there was obviously a few problems there, and I have a younger brother and a younger sister. There's roughly 2.5 years between us, going down to my sister. So obviously they were slightly more affected, I think. But then I went straight off to college, and the first place that my college was in Coventry, so I was living away. And the college, as was actually very good. It was actually at that time the Lanchester Poly, which is now Coventry University. But the environment wasn't very nice, and it was at the time when they had quite a lot of football violence and various riots going on. The campus was in the centre. So I transferred up to Sheffield, and I finished my degree in art at Sheffield at Salter Lane Hunters Bar, which that doesn't exist anymore. A lot of the places I've been to after my primary school have been pulled down. So somewhere along the line, I think as well, I mean, this goes back, I think, as well to school. I used to take photos, and I used to be known as the school photographer. It was an interest I had. My mother showed me how to develop black and whites. And I used to do things like take photos for friends, and then I'd bring the photos into school, and they'd complain about paying for them, because they thought you were being tight and stingy, asking them for money. So even though it might have cost 25 pence at that time for a 7x5 inch photo, they wouldn't pay 30 pence or 25 pence for it. And so I got the impression that I couldn't really ask people for money. I think that I lost my feeling of the worth of what I was doing, because I was taking on board their complaints. And I think this kind of developed through my later teens. And I remember a friend of mine and myself, we were going to see if we could find a job in the summer holidays when we were in the sixth form, so we would have been about 17 or 18. And he was actually a year older. We went to Barnsley to a glass company, and it turned out there was only one job available. And I thought, well, being afraid of work, my friend can have it. And also you have to get up at 6 o'clock in the morning and catch a bus, which was not in my vision at all. You know, if my mum can't take me in the car, I'm not going. You know, this is the sort of environment I think that I was in. So consequently, I didn't really have any pocket money from any earnings. I didn't get any really experience. I actually went and worked for a garden centre for a while, and I felt sort of put upon there because I was the youngest. This was at 16 years old. So when I basically left and finished my college and everything, I would have been probably about 23-ish. And I wanted to do everything I could to avoid having to get a normal job, because quite frankly, I wasn't ready. I just wanted to, I remember when I was 13, I looked at a sandpit that I used to play with my brother, and now toy cars and things, and I thought, I can't play in that anymore because I'm supposed to be grown up. And all my friends are into more sort of typically football and, you know, those sorts of things. So reluctantly I gave that up, and I kept on building things. But there was a time when you kind of realise that you've got to earn your own money. I actually put all my attention into personal relationships. So I had quite a few girlfriends over that next period of years. The first one that I lived with, of course, I was about 20. So we just rented somewhere. So right from the age of 20, I basically rented places, and I still rent places to this day. The other thing that I was nervous about, of course, as just hinted, was public transport. And so as soon as I was 17, I passed my driving test. When I was 18 and came back from college, I bought an old car off a garage that I worked for. I was a forecourt attendant at the time. But it wasn't a terribly good car, and some other cars that I had weren't terribly good either, so I had to pay for repairs. And this became a bit of the story of my life right into my 30s, where old cars cost more money than I really had available. And the sorts of jobs that I had were fairly low paid or temporary. I think the first actual job that I spent any time going to was when I was the first photographer at the sculpture park in 1984. I say first photographer though because it was an on-site position, and although it was part of the Manpower Services Commission, so it was sponsored by them, nevertheless, you know, they hadn't had somebody going around taking photos for press releases and looking after the archive. But I didn't stay there to the full year that I was offered, because I had an opportunity to go and do some self-employment. So I thought I took some business courses, and I went to some of what they called the seedbed workshops that they had in Barnsley near the railway station. And in there was a man who had been working with a partner, and I just joined him for a while. And without going into all the detail, because it's so long, we actually, our peak of experience was actually nearly getting a contract with Lego, which would have made us millionaires in a very short matter of time. But things sort of didn't go quite to plan and fell through. So then I was trying to do things like printing, and I thought I'll set up a card business or something. So I had some cards printed, and I got friends to donate colour photos of things they'd taken. And my brother donated me 4 of his paintings to use as greeting cards. And by the time I had to pay the printer, the money that I'd saved to pay the printer I'd used on cost of living, and probably repairing another car. So without anything else I could do, I reluctantly went and did teacher training in Plymouth, because they had an extra grant that went with it of about £1,300, because I went into the shortage area of craft design technology in secondary teaching. So there was that and maths. And so during that time, my parents shared the bailout, of the printer so that he wouldn't take me to court. But I then got my teacher training, and then I went back up to Yorkshire and worked on supply for nearly 3 years around Wakefield and Huddersfield and Barnsley. But it wasn't until I was about 31 that I got a job at Bedford College. I didn't really know anyone down there, but I applied, and most of the jobs I've ever had that have worked out quite well have been applications where I thought, well, I'll just make a throwaway one. I'm not really bothered about going, but I can do it, so I'll just send them off. And then I spent 8 years there, working as media resources, looking after all 10,000 students, equipment and stuff that they had there. And then, towards the end of that time, I had an opportunity to go to Belgium for a month to a company called Starlab, who are a sort of blue sky research place, and I actually went and visited them, and then I spent a month there. And when I came back, it helped me get a job at Cranfield University as what they called a module creator in one of the science departments. And we were making materials for the lecturers to show to the students, and some of that material went out to business at the time, like BAE Systems, love them or hate them. And that went all around the world. But Cranfield was a strange place to work, and it was only a short-term contract, and after that we finished, and I actually worked for them just for another year when I moved back up to Yorkshire. So I returned to Yorkshire in 2004, and then I seemed to manage to get another job, and I don't know why I got a job, but I did, and I got a job with Kirklees, working for a small group of people that called themselves Kirklees Collegiates. And what we did was go into schools and into colleges and help train the lecturers, teachers, and the children how to do e-learning, as it was the new thing coming in. And that was a 2-year contract that lasted 7 years before I decided to take early severance. But I realised that one of the things I'd proven to myself was that I wasn't actually lazy, and I wasn't actually afraid of work once I was in it. And actually I quite enjoyed those times that I had in work, and I thought, well, you did stick at it. So you stuck in some form of work for over 13 or 14 years. But I'm still really in a position where there was no sort of financial manoeuvring space. I had no savings. And in the end, I decided I would leave Kirklees and go try self-employment again, because I'd been to Starlab and I wrote the book Quantum Mass Superstructures, Creating the World You Experience. It was after I gave a talk to them there. And I thought I quite liked this. I'd always wanted to write a book, so I left and I started writing. But also, I used to do some website work, and I still do a small amount of website work for individuals and groups. And that basically became another bit of income. So I recognised at this stage that there was no financial help from family anymore, and you have to realise it's very embarrassing to ask for help, and particularly when it comes to money. And even when you ask a friend, can you lend me a tenner if we go out for a drink or something, it's an embarrassing thing to have to do. Some people perhaps don't care, but I did. So when I came up to Yorkshire, I actually had accrued a sort of a historic debt over the previous years with one thing and another. And of course, remember that through probably the 80s and 90s, credit was widely available. You were actually encouraged to borrow, and you were encouraged in all sorts of ways to have as many credit cards as you want, and loans and store cards. And I decided I wouldn't go that far, but I did have a credit card. And when I noticed that if you pay back in full, that's what you're advised to do. But there comes a point when you find that you actually can't pay back the full amount, so you drop into paying the monthly interest, basically. And once you start doing that, they love you. And once you reach your limit, they offer you another limit almost twice as high. At one point on one of my credit cards, I had £10,000 and it started with 500. It was then better to turn it into a loan because it was cheaper. By the time I got to Yorkshire, I owed £32,000. So I was working for nothing basically, because all the work that I did just paid for where I was at. And I decided that I wouldn't have a credit card again, I wouldn't borrow any money again. So from day one of moving back to Yorkshire, I lived totally within my means with a debit card and cash and nothing else. But I still had this on my shoulders in the background of this amount of debt. But I also realised that no conventional job that I could go and get with my qualifications and experience would ever give me enough to both live and pay that off. Now, the other thing I wanted to say about this is that I always held the intention to clear my debts. And this is important in anything you do. Your intention towards anything, whether it's money or anything that you want to do, is really important. So, for example, swatting a fly analogy. Now, I don't like to kill anything at all, but I am contradictory and hypocritical in the sense that I do still eat meat, which I'd rather be vegetarian, but I haven't really managed to achieve it. So you could say, well, if you don't want to kill anything, you can't really eat meat. But that's aside from another discussion. If you imagine a fly, your intention can be to swat it and kill it, or as it is for me, is to open the window and try and let it out. And the intention behind things is very important. And having the intention